My dad gave a company 40 honest years, and the finance chief branded him a thief to hide his own skimming. So I had him hauled out in cuffs at my dad's own send-off. You ever meet a man who shakes your hand while already deciding how to use you? That was Sterling. He ran the money side of the company like he owned the building, the staff, and the air itself. To Sterling, workers were tools, used up and thrown out. My father, Lionel, had given that company 40 years. He had climbed the slow, honest way from the loading floor. He was the man everyone trusted, the one who stayed late, the one who never took so much as a pen that was not his. That good name was the whole story of his life, which is exactly why Sterling needed him. A man like Sterling never carries his own blame. He finds the most trusted man in the building and hangs it around that man's neck, because no one questions a story that lands on someone everybody already believes is good. It started small. A little money went missing, and Sterling raised it gently, like it pained him to bring it up. Then more was gone. Then he sat with the owners wearing a heavy, sad face, and said the books showed the money had been moved by someone who had touched those accounts for years, and the only man who fit was my father. He had no proof, and he did not need any, because Sterling controlled every number in that building, and Sterling was believed. Inside a few weeks it was finished. 40 years ended not with a gold watch, but with a quiet shove out the door, his name marked, his pension held back, and every old friend suddenly too busy to pick up the phone. My father came home, sat at the kitchen table, and said, 40 years, and they think I'm a thief. I would have given anything to lift it off him. Instead, I decided to do something better. I did not storm into that building. I did not threaten anyone. I did not make any noise, because noise was exactly what a man like Sterling knew how to handle. So I went quiet, and I went slow, and I let him believe he had won clean. While he relaxed, I learned things. The first thing I learned was that my father was not the first. Years before, a well-liked old hand named Harlan had gotten too close to how Sterling moved money around, and Harlan had been pushed out under the same gray cloud. Nobody had ever set the two men side by side, because Sterling was careful to burn only one trusted man at a time, always one near the end of his road and too tired to fight back. The second thing I learned mattered more. Sterling's power came from one place. He controlled the books. He had spent years turning himself into the one man nobody could ever check. He had made himself the only door, and you do not break the only door. So I built another one. I found an outside auditor, a woman named Della, with no stake in the company and no seat at Sterling's table, whose only job was to look hard at the numbers when someone raised a real question. I never told her what to find. I just helped the people he had stepped on reach her, the old clerk once told to stop asking questions, and at last Harlan, who walked her through his whole story and watched her face change. You never have to push a man like Sterling. You only have to wait, because greed never learns where to stop. While Della quietly followed the money, Sterling kept right on skimming. Sure, the books were his alone. She traced every missing dollar back through the accounts, and the trail did not lead to my father or Harlan or any of the trusted old men who had taken the fall. It led to one office, the office of the very man who had pointed at all of them. Then came the party. The company threw my father a small, polite send-off, and Sterling came gladly, ready to play the gracious boss and shake the hand of the man he had ruined. He did not know Della had handed her findings to the owners that week, or that I had made certain the party went ahead on that exact day. He was holding a glass and telling a story to a circle of people when the owner crossed the floor toward him, and beside the owner walked Della and two men my father did not recognize. The smile slid off Sterling's face an inch at a time. The owner did not make a speech. He stopped in front of Sterling and said, "Lo, it was you the whole time. Walk with these men." And Sterling, the man who had walked my father out of that building, was walked out of that party in front of every single person who had ever feared him, while my father stood by the cake with a fork still in his hand and watched it happen. I thought that night was the end of it. I was wrong. Within days, Sterling was out on bail. He had a sharp lawyer, the kind of guy who talks soft and moves fast and makes you feel like you're the one who did something wrong. The lawyer filed motions right away. He claimed the audit had been done improperly. He said Della had no authorized access to the company's financial records and that everything she found was tainted. He argued the whole thing should be thrown out. And just like that, the owners who had walked Sterling out went quiet, because Sterling's lawyer was not just defending him. He was threatening to countersue the company for wrongful termination and defamation, saying Sterling had been fired without cause and humiliated publicly. I sat in my car and gripped the steering wheel. Sterling being walked out was not the final chapter. It was the opening move of a fight he had been fighting longer than I had been alive. He started working the phones right away, not through his lawyer. He called old colleagues himself, people he had worked beside for years. He did not threaten them. That was not his style. He reminded them. One man later told me Sterling had called him and said, "You remember who approved your raise 3 years ago? That was me. You remember who looked the other way when your department went over budget? Me." He was not building a defense. He was rebuilding a wall made out of people who owed him, people who were too tangled up in small favors and old debts to ever stand up. He did not need them to love him. He just needed them to stay quiet. I drove out to Harlan's place on a Tuesday morning because I needed to know he was still with us. He opened the door looking like he had not slept in days. His eyes were red. He let out a long breath and said, "Sterling called me last night. He said if I go on record, he'll tell everyone I was the one skimming back when I worked there. He said he kept records." I asked if any of it was true. He looked at me like I had slapped him. Of course it's not true, but that's the thing about Sterling. He doesn't need it to be true. He just needs people to hear it. And he was right. Sterling did not need facts. He needed whispers. He needed just enough doubt floating around that nobody wanted to get close to the mess. I could see Harlan pulling away, getting ready to tell me he was done, so I told him the truth. "Harlan, this is exactly what he did to my dad." He pointed a finger and let the fear do the rest. My dad went quiet. He walked away. He sat at his kitchen table and accepted it. And Sterling kept going. If you walk away now, he wins the same way he always wins. Not because he's right, but because everyone's too scared to say he's wrong. Harlan rubbed his face with both hands and finally said, "Fine, I'll stay. But if that man comes after me, you better be standing right next to me when he does." I told him I would. He agreed, but barely. I could tell he was one more phone call from Sterling away from changing his mind. I called Della from the car. Her voice was tight. "His lawyer is trying to get my report excluded. If they succeed, there's no paper trail. It's just your word against his, and he's been winning that fight for 20 years. She needed the company's original authorization letter, the one proving the owners had asked her to come in and audit. Without it, his lawyer would argue she had no right to touch those records, and everything she found became useless. I drove to the company that afternoon. I sat down with the owners, and the second I brought up the letter, I saw it in their faces. They were scared. Sterling's lawyer had gotten to them. One of them kept looking at his phone like he was expecting a call. The other one said they needed to think about it and talk to their own legal team first. They did not reach for a pen. They did not open a drawer. They just sat there. Two men who had been brave enough to walk Sterling out of a party, but were now too afraid to sign a piece of paper. I drove home with nothing. For the first time since I had started all of this, I felt the ground shifting under me. Everything I had built depended on people being brave enough to do the right thing, and Sterling's whole career had been built on on making sure nobody ever was. That evening, I walked into the kitchen and my father was sitting at the table. The same chair, the same spot where he had sat months ago and told me they thought he was a thief. He looked at me and said, "Is it falling apart?" I said no. I said everything was fine, that the lawyer stuff was normal, that Della had it under control. He kept looking at me. Then he shook his head and said, "You're a bad liar. You always were, just like me." And he smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made my throat tight because there was no hope in it. It was the smile of a man who had already accepted the worst. I went to my room that night and thought about losing this. If Sterling's lawyer got Della's report thrown out, if the owners never signed that letter, if Harlan folded, my father going back to being the man the world had decided he was, a thief, a liar, a man whose 40 years meant nothing. And the worst part was that if I failed, my father would not be angry. He would not blame me. He would just nod and accept it because he had already spent months learning how to believe the world was right about him, and I could not let that happen. The next morning, I called Alexander, my best friend since we were kids, who worked in corporate administration at a different company. I drove over and told him where things stood. He listened, then put his coffee down and said, "You've got a small window. Once his lawyer files a preservation order, nobody touches those servers without a judge's sign-off. You need that letter signed today, not tomorrow." I asked how he knew. He looked at me and said, "Because I watched my own company go through something like this. The guy who was guilty walked because everyone moved too slow." He said it flat, no drama, just a fact he had learned the hard way, and that fact hit me like cold water. Today, not tomorrow. I thanked him and drove straight back to the owner's office. I did not call ahead. I walked in and I did not sit down. I stood in front of his desk and said, "If you don't sign this letter today, Sterling walks. And if he walks, he sues you. And the story becomes that you authorized everything. You are not protecting yourself by waiting. You are handing him the weapon." The owner looked at me for a long moment. I could see the fear pulling one way and the logic pulling the other. He knew I was right. The only difference now was that I was not giving him room to pretend he had more time. He opened his desk drawer. He pulled out a sheet of paper. He read it once, slowly. Then he picked up a pen and signed his name at the bottom. He slid it across the desk to me without a word. I took it and walked out of that building holding a single piece of paper that felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. I got it to Della that afternoon. By evening, she was inside the company's email server, going through everything Sterling's lawyer had referenced. I tried to sleep, but I could not. At 11 o'clock, my phone rang. 3 of the authorization emails Sterling's lawyer referenced were created 8 days ago, she said. The metadata is clear. The timestamps on the server show exactly when they were made. The originals don't exist. There are no earlier versions, no drafts, no forwarded copies, nothing. He built them after the arrest. I sat on the edge of my bed and let that sink in. Sterling had been walked out in front of everyone, then gone home and sat at his own computer and built fake emails to make it look like the company had approved what he had been doing all along. He had not just stolen the money or framed my father. He had forged evidence after the fact, and in doing so, he had handed us something his lawyer could never explain away. I felt something settle in my chest. Not excitement, not relief. Something quieter than that. Something like the feeling you get when you have been holding your breath for a long time and you finally know it is safe to let it out. Sterling had spent 30 years making himself untouchable, but he had made those fake emails in a hurry, scared and sloppy, and the server did not care how smart he thought he was. The server just kept track of when things were made, and now Della had it all. The next few days felt lighter. Della forwarded her findings to the prosecutor. My father started to look like himself again. Not all the way, but closer. He stood a little straighter. He even cracked a joke at dinner one night, looked down at his empty wrist and said, "You know, I never did get that gold watch." And he laughed. It was a small, tired laugh, but it was real. I should have known better. It was a Thursday evening. We had just finished eating and I was washing dishes. My father was in the living room with the television on low. I heard his phone ring. I did not think anything of it, but something made me turn off the water and listen. I could not hear what was being said, just the low hum of a voice. What I could see was my father's face. He had answered with a normal expression, but within seconds it changed. It went still. Not angry, not scared, just still, like someone had pressed pause on him. He listened for what had to be 2 full minutes, and those 2 minutes were some of the longest of my life. Then he pulled the phone away from his ear and set it down on the arm of his chair. I walked in. I asked who it was. He said very quietly, "It was Sterling." Everything in me went tight. I asked what he said. My father did not answer right away. He stood up, then seemed to change his mind and sat back down, slowly, like his legs were not sure they wanted to hold him. He put his hands on his knees and I could see them shaking. Not a lot, just enough. He said he was sorry. He said we were both just men trying to survive a place that chewed people up. He paused. He swallowed. Then he said your mother would be ashamed of what you're doing to an old man. The room got very small. I could hear the television still going, some game show with a crowd clapping, and it sounded like it was coming from 100 miles away. My father looked up at me and said, "He brought up your mother." His voice cracked on the last word. I was furious. I could feel it climbing up through my chest and into my jaw, and I wanted to get in my car and drive to wherever Sterling was. But then I looked at my father's face and the fury stopped cold. Because Lionel was not angry. He looked confused. He looked like a man sitting in his own living room wondering if maybe the person who destroyed his life had a point. That look scared me more than anything Sterling had ever done. I sat down across from him and said, "Dad, he stole from them. He framed you. He destroyed Harlan. He forged emails last week. This is not a man who is sorry." Lionel nodded like the words made sense to his brain. But then he said, "40 years I worked beside him. I keep thinking, what if I missed something? What if I could have stopped it back then?" And I understood what Sterling had done. The phone call was not an apology. It was a weapon, aimed right at the softest part of my father. Sterling was trying to make my father feel guilty. Guilty enough to doubt. Guilty enough to look at his own son and say, maybe we should stop. He could not beat the evidence. He could not beat Della. So he went after the one person whose word could shut the whole thing down. I left the room and called Della. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "That's witness tampering. The prosecutor needs to know about this tonight. But more than that, it tells you something. He's not fighting to win anymore. He's fighting to make your father quit. That's what a cornered man does." I called the prosecutor's office and reported the call. They took it seriously, but the legal part was not what worried me that night. My father did. I went back into the living room. The television was off now. He was just sitting in the quiet. I pulled a chair over and sat down close. "Dad, he called you because he's losing, not because he's sorry. A sorry man doesn't bring up your dead wife to make you feel small. He did that because he knows the only person who can stop this now is you, and he's trying to get inside your head the way he got inside the books." My father did not say anything. The clock in the hallway ticked. The fridge hummed in the kitchen. I waited. I did not push. I just sat there beside him the way he used to sit beside me when I was a kid and upset about something. A long time passed. Then Lionel looked up. His eyes were clear. Not happy, not fierce, but clear, like something had settled. And he said, "Then I guess I'd better not let him." He said it the way a man says something he means all the way down to the floor. Up until that moment, Every step of this fight had been mine. I had found Della. I had reached Harlan. I had pushed the owners. But right there, Lionel chose to stand. Not because I asked, because Sterling reached for the one weapon that should have worked, the memory of the woman Lionel loved most. And instead of breaking my father, it showed him exactly what kind of man was on the other end of that phone. The prosecutor moved fast. Within days, a hearing was on the calendar. Sterling's lawyer filed every motion he could think of, but the forged emails and the phone call had changed the picture. The judge denied the delay. I sat in the gallery and watched Sterling walk in. He looked like a man who still believed he could talk his way out of a room. His lawyer argued the audit was unauthorized. The prosecutor stood up and presented the signed authorization letter, the one I had refused to leave that office without. The lawyer pivoted. He said the emails were legitimate company communications, that they proved the payments had been approved as bonuses. The prosecutor called Della. She walked up the same way she did everything, calm, steady, like the room was just another set of numbers. She explained the metadata. She showed the exact date and time each of those 3 emails had been created, 8 days after Sterling's arrest. All 3 built on Sterling's own home computer. No earlier versions, no drafts, no forwarding history, nothing. She laid it out so simply there was nothing to argue with. Sterling sat very still. His lawyer whispered to him, then stood and asked for a recess. The judge said no. The prosecutor called Harlan. He walked up looking like a man who had not slept in weeks but had decided to show up anyway. His voice shook when he started. He described how Sterling had pushed him out years before under the same kind of false accusations. He described the phone call telling him to stay quiet or be accused of the same thing all over again. He looked at Sterling once, just once, and said, "You told me nobody would believe me. You were wrong." Then the prosecutor called my father. I watched Lionel stand up and walk to the front of that room. He was not a man who spoke easily in front of people. He never had been, but his hands were still. He did not look at Sterling. He answered every question plain and straight. No extra words, no drama. When they asked about the phone call, he repeated exactly what Sterling had said. Every word, including the part about my mother. The room went quiet, not the polite kind, the kind where nobody moves. Lionel looked straight ahead and said, "I gave that company 40 years. I never took a thing that wasn't mine. And this man took my name and used it to cover what he'd been doing all along. My son gave me this chance. I won't waste it." Sterling's lawyer stood up and asked to approach the bench. There was a low conversation I could not hear from where I sat. It lasted maybe a minute. Then Sterling stood. His lawyer turned to the room and said that Sterling would accept a plea. Sterling did not speak. He did not look at Lionel. He did not look at me. He was walked out of that courtroom the same way he had been walked out of the party. But this time there was no chin held high. This time his shoulders were low and his eyes were on the floor, because every wall he had spent 30 years building was made of paper. The judge turned to my father. He said the record would reflect that the accusations against Lionel were fabricated and that his name was cleared. My father nodded. He did not smile. He just breathed, slow and deep, like a man setting down something so heavy he had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. I sat in that gallery and felt something open up in my own chest that I had not even known was shut. Outside the courthouse, Lionel stood on the steps and did not move for a while. I walked up beside him. He was looking out at nothing in particular, just standing there in the afternoon light. "Your mother would have liked today," he said. I looked at him and said, "She would have liked that you stood up in there." He nodded. We drove home in quiet. At the kitchen table, the same table where Lionel had first sat down months ago and said, "They think I'm a thief." He pulled out his chair and sat down. He rested his hands flat on the surface, palms down, like he was making sure it was real. He looked up at me and said, "40 years, and now they know." I did not say anything. I did not need to. Some things do not need words. They just need to be finished.